Australia's property markets going to crash? Are we headed for the same fate as the United States, Ireland, Spain, where property markets crumbled? Well, that's what some commentators are suggesting. They say Australia's property market is a giant speculative bubble propelled by tax breaks, low interest rates, liar loans, and that's led to massive mortgage stress, they're suggesting, and it's all going to bust, bringing us down, bringing down the banks, bringing down our economy with it. While others, and in my mind, more informed commentators, say we're different and you shouldn't compare the Australian property markets with overseas markets. Is this true? Are we really different, or are we kidding ourselves? To find out the answer, let's ask Australia's leading housing economist, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market. Good morning, Andrew.
Morning, Michael.
Well, the trouble is we're hearing the same thing for years, calls for a property market crash, that we've been pumping up our markets. Are we different, or are we just kidding ourselves?
Well, we're absolutely different, Michael, and we're different at so many levels. I think the one common bond that we do have in terms of influences on our housing market that are common to other advanced economies, of course, is, I guess, the global economy and its movement in interest rates. And even then, we've seen a diversity from what's been the global experience for interest rates since the GFC and what we've experienced.
Well, one of the things that is underpinning our property markets is our strong population growth. We're growing at around 400,000 people per annum, but it's concentrated in a number of big capital cities. At the same time, supply hasn't really kept up with demand. We're not creating enough of the right sort of property, Andrew, are we?
Well, look, yes, Michael, but again, we have to look deeper into the population issue. It's an issue of migration. And there are other countries that have strong migration similar to Australia, but don't have the same drive into the housing market that we do from our migration. And that's because we have a highly selective migration program. Those that come into our country have to pass a number of wealth guidelines, which of course mean that they are capable of being homeowners. And that's a big difference.
So in general, though, was because people were at household formation age, and as you say, they came with the ability to work and the desire to work, which is great as well. Another difference between Australia and overseas, as I said, Andrew, is our sound banking system. It's well regulated, it's risk averse, and the lending standards have improved, and they're much more stringent since the Haynes Royal Commission.
Our lending standards have always been appropriate, has been seen by the nature of our housing cycle, particularly in terms of mortgage arrears and mortgage defaults. I mean, that mortgage arrear and mortgage default measure would typically reflect stress in the housing market. So I think that our banking system has remained rigid, risk averse, as you suggested. And I think, if anything, to its detriment, it's overmanaged risk, but it's not really the Royal Commission. It's been those questionable actions by APRA, which clearly overmanaged risk during the 15 through to last year, early 19 period, where there was a sense that our banks were exposed on the basis of no real local evidence.
Well, what it's also caused is the number of interest-only loans to decrease.
Yes.
High loan-to-value ratio loans have been falling lately. So if anything, it has had that sort of effect that is going to stop some of the concerns of people. But I think the big difference between Australia and overseas with regard to loans is overseas there were a lot of non-recourse loans where you could hand in the keys at the end and walk away. And I'm sure you remember the so-called ninja loans. No income, no jobs, no assets. Those were the subprime low doc loans that surged in the United States prior to the global financial crisis. We've never had anything like that in Australia.
Well, our financial system is fundamentally different, Michael. We have 4 major providers of finance, so there's not a lot of competition between them, even though there's been attempts to create a more competitive financial environment with smaller lenders. It really hasn't impacted the market power of the big 4 banks, and I think that's a good thing. It is about keeping risk managed.
One of the issues people are suggesting is going to create Australia's property market crash is the level of debt. But in my mind, the debt's in general in the right hands. Much of the increase in debt's gone to older, wealthier Australians who are better able to service their loans, and much of it is against good assets that go up, residential real estate.
Well, this debt mantra that we've been confronted with has become the new boogeyman, Michael. I don't believe it's debt that's an issue with our economy. And I think it's low incomes growth that's constraining consumption, not fear about debt. All we have to do is measure the proportion of incomes that are being used to service debt, and we can see it's at levels that are consistent with the long-term low average of repayment proportion of income. And of course, falling interest rates mean that you are able to borrow more with the same income. So your debt rises, but the proportion of the income that you're paying off your debt remains the same. And in fact, that's fallen in Australia, and Australians have become more wary of debt, perhaps through this mantra of the debt mountain, and have been paying off their credit card and their debts.
There's another factor that's underlying our Australian housing markets, and that's our culture, our aspiration to own homes. Very different to overseas, so that 70% of Australians own homes. And then those that don't tend to be tenants of private investors, not governments. There are two big differences in the way the ownership of Australian real estate is compared to overseas.
Absolutely, Michael. And we have very strong aspiration for home ownership in this country. We also have very strong aspiration for home investment as a wealth creator. And these are from small enterprises that typically get involved. Now, this is different to overseas. And I think the other point is that those that are renting, that are tenants, in the main, tend to be in the queue for home ownership anyway.
Well, the government wants us to as well. They've got incentives to help people get into the market. They understand that Australians want that, and they do actually support property investment. And some people would say the tax incentives are unfair, but it's always been part of our system, and negative gearing's been a feature of Australia's tax system for businesses as well as property investors for a long time. And there are capital gains tax exemptions. Clearly, the government's on the side of property as well. Before I round off, Andrew, are there any other points you want to make?
Well, there's a couple, Michael. Firstly, on the supply side, that's always important in the housing market. And we have a unique supply environment in this country. Obviously, supply is generated by state and local governments. They're the main providers of that. This creates a lot of significant roadblocks to new supply. So over the longer term, we tend to be an undersupplied with demand ahead of supply over. And that's because of a lot of these roadblocks to development that we do have. And the other factor, Michael, is public housing. The two cultural differences are that we have abandoned public housing as a major housing source. We now rely on the private sector for much of our rental accommodation. We still have public housing, and we still have a strong commitment to those that are marginalised in the community for housing, and so we should. But there's not a culture of public housing as we have in particularly a lot of European countries and in the US, with rent control in some of the bigger cities there. The other point is that when we spoke about home ownership, there's very strong cultures in Europe and in the US of renting for life. People are quite happy to be tenants in larger numbers for life, and that is, again, a different cultural focus that we have in this country, where we're much more concentrated on being homeowners, and those that are renting tend to be renting in the queue to become homeowners rather than a permanent base.
I guess when I hear arguments of this time it will be different or we are different, I think people don't really understand what's going on. They're kidding themselves a bit. But I think clearly, Andrew, you have pointed out that Australia's property markets are different, shouldn't compare ourselves with overseas. Yes, there's a few issues with the economy. Yes, there's problems with wages growth, but the underlying fundamentals for Australian property are sound, and I can't see us heading for the same fate as happened overseas. I think the other thing to remember is there isn't an Australian property market. There are multiple markets. And as you said, some states overshot the mark, particularly Melbourne and Sydney. They've under for a while now, they're catching up. And then even within each state, there are different price points, different geographic locations, different types of dwellings. So on balance, Australia's property markets are different, and don't worry about what happened overseas. Be more aware of what's happening locally and take a good long-term perspective. Thank you very much for your time once again, Andrew. Look forward to our chat next week.
Good on you. Thank you.